Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for quieting down as soon as I got up here and started speaking. This is wonderful. My name is Tom Morgan, and I'm delighted you're here for another season here at the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice. This year's topic, overarching topic, is the future of capitalism, and so we have three major programs this year. Instead of four. Last year we had four, but we're a little short on capital this year, so we're only having three. But I think there'll be three really good ones. And to dealing with the whole subject of the economic system under which we operate. This series is sponsored by, of course, the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice, and funded in part by the Lee and Rose Warner Foundation, the Global Awareness Fund of the Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation, Reader Weekly, and special support from the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Everen Foundation and from Mary C. Van Everen in memory of William P. Van Everen, former trustee of the college, and of course special thanks to this continuing support from the Alworth family here in Duluth. These things wouldn't happen with all that kind of generous support, so thank you very much. Our speaker this evening is a senior associate at the Tellus Institute in Boston, which works to advance the global civilization of sustainability, equity, and well-being through research, education, and action. She herself is co-founder of Corporation 2020. It's a project to create the vision and chart the course for the corporation of the future. Ms. Kelly also was co-founder and president of the company that published Business Ethics, a national magazine on corporate social responsibility that was launched in 1987. And she's the author of The Divine Right of Capital, a book calling for a more democratically responsible corporate design. Library Journal named it one of the best business books of the year. Ms. Kelly is a board member of Great Neighborhoods Development Corporation in Minneapolis and is on the steering committee of the Strategic Corporate Initiative sponsored by Corporate Ethics International. She also serves on advisory boards for the International Institute for Corporate Governance and Accountability at George Washington University Law School, the Capital Ownership Group, and the Citizens Works Corporate Reform Commission. She holds a master's degree in magazine journalism and a bachelor's in English from the University of Missouri. She's lived in Minneapolis for 15 years, where she was active at the Dharma Field Zen Center and chaired the advisory board of Citizens for Corporate Responsibility, which drafted legislation to create a new legal form for the responsible corporation. She spent her formative years in the Midwest at Catholic schools and comes from a good Catholic family of 8 children. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Marjorie Kelly.
Water up here?
Oh, yeah. Water.
Water.
You promised us water. I don't see it.
All right.
It comes.
Okay, good. Well, Tom, thank you for that very generous introduction. And I want to thank the College of St. Scholastica for having me here. It's wonderful to be back in Duluth. Lake Superior is one of my very favorite spots on the earth. Many years ago, I took a bike trip from Minneapolis to Canada, and we rode along the north shore of Lake Superior. Normally when you're traveling, you're powered by fuel. We were powered by pie, and you have some of the most wonderful pie in this region here, and you're very lucky to be living in the Lake Superior region, and it's fun to be back. Well, you heard a little bit about me. I want to learn just a little bit about you as we get started here. First of all, I'm curious, how many people have been studying my book, The Divine Right of Capital, in your class? If I could just see a show of hands. So a few, okay. And how many people are here tonight because your professor strongly suggested it? Well, we have a few, but we have a few willing listeners too, so that's nice. Okay, and then I just have a final question, and that is, oh, very good, thank you. As you look around our economy today, I'd like you to say, in one word, what are you feeling or thinking about it? Screwed. We hear a few others. Greed, I heard one. What was the other one? Doom. I think it was doom. Any others? Just a couple? What was that one? Inequity. Okay. Economic Darwinism. Interesting. Uncertainty. Unemployment. Right. Very good. Greed, doom, unemployment, uncertainty. I think that a lot of Americans share these views and these thoughts on our economy. So I'm here tonight to kick off the lecture series on the future of capitalism. So what is it that we can say about that? It's a topic that for many of us is, I'm going to pause here for a moment. Am I getting on both speakers? Can we pull that one aside? Okay. I want to start bringing a frame for understanding where we find ourselves today. And then I want to move to a little out-of-the-box thinking. I think we ought to go. And I want to conclude with some thoughts that where we're heading, I think there's a chance, we don't know how large a chance, but there's some chance that where we're heading might be really quite positive. So that's where we're heading. And I know that right now things certainly don't feel positive. I mean, we have what many are saying is the greatest crisis since the Great Depression. An ecological crisis we're facing is likely to change our lives in ways we don't even begin to imagine. I want to talk about that just for a moment as we get started here. You know, there are moments, I think, in our local crisis, it comes out of the headlines and it starts to be real, and you feel it in your own life. And one of these moments happened for me. It was a few years ago. I was visiting my friend Richard, who lives at the Wisconsin River near. He told me this story that has haunted me since then. He said that there was one day he was standing in a field of goldenrod, and he could tell that something was wrong, but he didn't know what. And he was standing there, and he said, finally it hit me. Where are all the bugs? When he was a kid, Richard said he used to collect bugs, and he would always go to a stand of goldenrod, because he would take one swipe of the net, and he would get 100 species. On this day, he saw one lone honeybee. He said that's why all the toads are gone. It used to be that he couldn't walk along the Wisconsin River without stepping on a toad. And he told me, I can't remember the last time I saw a toad. It's been years. Toads, frogs, other amphibians, 1 out of 3 of these species today are threatened with extinction. You know, it's the water quality from human activity is degrading to such extent that creatures who live in the water can't survive. Well, it's happening to birds too. In Massachusetts, where I live now, the number of birds from the time I was in high school until now, it's about 30 years. The number of birds in Massachusetts have dropped in half. And I don't mean the number of species, I mean the physical number of birds have dropped in half. And you think, well, if that can happen in 30 years, what's going to happen in the next 30 years? It's a very sobering kind of question. So at the same time that the biosphere is suffering, humans, of course, are suffering tremendously as well. People seem to be, I would say, kind of slipping through the cracks in a funny way and kind of disappearing. I was in Minneapolis not long ago, and a friend there told me a story of a colleague of hers who I'll call Peter. And Peter had been a top salesman at an insurance company, and we're talking somebody who made 6 figures, until the company decided to cut his commission levels in half. He couldn't make it on that, so he lost that job. He and his wife ended up losing their house, and they ended up living in a tiny travel trailer on a piece of land out in the country. And Peter he suffers from very severe diabetes, and he's not able to get the drugs that he needs because he can't afford the $20 copay every month that would cost. And the truly tragic piece about all this is, while this was happening, he didn't tell anyone, he didn't ask for help, he just kind of quietly disappeared. I think that a lot of us are hearing these kinds of stories. 15 million Americans today are out of work. A third of those are long-term unemployed. And 6 million homes are in the foreclosure pipeline. And what that means is people have either started down the process to foreclosure or are missing payments. And yes, 10% of all mortgages today are in trouble. Now, so while this process that's happening is an acute one, if we really want to understand it, we need to see that it's the culmination of a process that's been 30 years in the making. Real wages in this country stopped climbing in 1970, and they haven't been climbing since. So for most people, their incomes have been stagnant for 3 decades. Now, the other extraordinary piece about that is, at the same time, productivity has been climbing dramatically. So what this means is that you have people producing more and more and more, and wages staying flat. Now, when that happens, there's a gap that opens up. And the gap between people who produce more and more for their employer but are paid the same. And that gap is called profit. Now, profits have been soaring in this country for 30 years. And profits, as we know, are what fuel CEO pay. They fuel the increase of stock price, and they fuel the incomes of the very top earners in this country. And all 3 of these have been soaring in recent decades. There was one study that found, for example, in a 5-year period around the year 2000, that if you look at the total real national gain in income, far more of that went to the top 1% than to the bottom half of the country. So what this means over time is that so much wealth has accumulated at the top of the economy that people have begun to have a hard time finding a place to invest it all. And it's a phenomenon that the financial press likes to call excess liquidity. And really it means buckets and buckets of money sloshing around the globe looking for a place to be invested. Now, economists also have a word for this process, and they call it financialization. And financialization can be defined as a shift in the gravity of economic activity from production to finance. Historian Kevin Phillips said it more simply. He said, moving money around has replaced making things as a share of US GDP. Now, this happened in the year 2000, when manufacturing slipped to 14% of GDP and finance rose to 20%. So what that means roughly is GDP is gross domestic product. You know, it's all the money that flows through an economy in a year. If you make $20,000, your GDP is $20,000. So of all the money flowing through the economy, more is coming now from people moving money around than from those who actually are making things. When you look at profits, this change is far more dramatic. Now, profit is what a company has left over after it pays its bills. So you have money coming in, you pay your expenses, you got profit left over. Now, it used to be in this country that in 1950, manufacturing made about 60% of all U.S. corporate profits. That fell to about 5%. The reverse happened with finance. It went from about 8%, it swelled all the way to 40%. Now, when you look at these numbers, you can start to hear a giant sucking sound in our economy. It's that wealth is coming out of the hands of American workers, it's coming out of the biosphere and going up into a financial bubble at the very top of the economy. Now, we can ask ourselves, what is financial wealth? It's essentially claims against real assets. So you have mortgage debt, that's a claim against the value of a house, or credit card debt is a claim against future income. Now, there was a time not too long ago when the total of all financial claims, financial assets, was roughly equal to global GDP. So essentially you had $1 of claims and $1 of flows. There was some kind of rough balance with that. But before the meltdown, claims swelled to 4 times GDP. And if you take financial derivatives, which we won't get into too much detail, but they're basically, kind of these claims. Those were 10 times GDP. So we had a house of cards on top of an asset bubble. Charles Morris, in his book $1 Trillion Meltdown, he says, think of an inverted pyramid. The more claims are on top of real output, the more wobbly the pyramid becomes. And when large, wobbly objects tumble, they go very fast. So this is what happened. This happened in 2008 when we saw stock markets fall 42%. We saw $29 trillion in wealth wiped out. And I think most of us, kind of hurts your head to think about $29 trillion. It's impossible to imagine. Now, Chairman of Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, is today saying, well, I think the recession is over. But of course, it's not over for the 16 million Americans who don't have jobs. So if we want to understand the crises that we're facing, I think it's helpful to step back and see it in the proper frame. So what this means is we're not in a banking crisis. We're not in a stock market crisis. We're not in an ecological crisis. And it's not even a global warming crisis. It's a crisis of a global system. And that system is capitalism as we have known it. It's a system that is hitting the limits of its own logic. Now, the name itself tells us what that logic is. Capitalism is about extracting capital from the world and using it to make more capital. But the problem is that you can only extract so much before the world becomes exhausted. Now, American workers today are working 20% more hours than they were in the past. People are sheltering. Families have tens of thousands of dollars more in debt than they had decades ago. So people just can't work harder. They can't absorb more debt. The atmosphere can't absorb more carbon. And the toads and the birds can't survive the world that we're creating. So what's happening is that we're reaching the limits of the kind of capitalism our society has become. There are system limits that are being hit. Now, when we search for words, it's very hard to know what exactly is it we're talking about here. So when we search for words for this, we can use the words of economics. We can say financial claims are growing to the breaking point. Or we can use the language of democracy, and we can say an essential social contract has been broken. A contract that says if you work hard and you play by the rules, you ought to make enough money to live a decent life. These are the kinds of the discourse, the language that we generally use, and it points toward particular kinds of outcomes. And those outcomes are generally about more government regulation. So we say, well, we need better banking standards. We need regulation of derivatives. We need more help for homeowners. We need to cap and trade carbon. And we do. We do need those things. We certainly do. But I would suggest that because of the nature of the change that we're at, this threshold of change, that there are deeper changes that we need to pursue at the same time. We often say that, we operate out of a mind that says it's the role of democracy to restrain corporations. And I would like to suggest tonight that perhaps it's the role of democracy to transform corporations. And so what would that look like? How do we begin to talk about that? We need really a new language, and I would say it's the language of systems science. Now, systems science in fields as diverse as physics, where it was created, or biology, or economics, is beginning to emerge today as a language of wholeness. Now, it's the language of democracy. It tells us all persons are created equal. The language of systems science goes farther, and what it says is that we're not isolated, separate, equal individuals. That we're, in fact, we're part of one whole. And that's a literal truth, not just a nice way of speaking. We're part of one community, one society, one earth. And system science also teaches us that all living systems, all natural systems, share certain qualities. It could be a microbe, it could be an ecosystem, it could be an economy, share these certain qualities. And one of them is that living systems are self-organizing. They can be described as open systems in a steady state. And that's kind of fancy language for just saying, living systems, you need to have stuff flowing through them. We need food coming through us. We need oxygen coming through us. Ecosystems need water and sunlight flowing through them. So they're open. There's this constant throughput of energy. And they maintain a steady state with all this throughput by a self-repair of their internal structures. So we're not out there repairing the trees. The trees are repairing themselves. So living systems have this quality of being self-organizing. But there's something else that systems science tells us, and that is that when systems outside, or when the conditions outside a system change dramatically, systems can transform themselves. They can make this sudden creative advance into novelty. I mean, they've seen this happen with chemical solutions. We've seen it happen with forests. It happens with societies. So there's this tremendous kind of self-creativity that happens when systems get themselves in trouble. Now, this is a new kind of language for me, being a journalist and kind of an economic theorist, but I'm at the Tellus Institute in Boston. For 30 years, it's been an institute run by system scientists who've been studying ecological conditions around the globe and trying to raise some concern about what might come next, or sort of the mess that we're getting ourselves into. And what they're saying is that we can understand what's happening today by looking at it as a systemic crisis at the scale of the planet. We know that systems can transform themselves, but it's happened always at the subsystem level. It's happened at the level of a forest or a family or a community or a nation, but it's global. It's global right now. And the problem is that global civilization simply isn't organized correctly to handle the scale of the problems that we're facing. And what this means is that we're on the threshold of a social order. It could be as large as the advent of the agricultural revolution or the dawn of the industrial revolution. Something very, very big is in the making. Now, the other thing that system scientists will tell us is, history and the future don't work the way we kind of think they do, that there's this line of activity, from past into the present, into the future, and you can sort of see where we've been and sort of track where we're going to go. Well, that's not the way it works. Is that there's really, when you go to the future, and this is the thing that physicists always blow my mind. Physicists say that the future doesn't really exist because we haven't invented it yet. Yes, there are trends, but how we respond to those, how they change, that's the future. So we don't know what's out there. There's no way to know because it doesn't exist yet. And so scientists are saying, yes, we could shift into a breakdown state. I mean, that credible Nobel Prize-winning scientists who are out there raising arms saying, we could shift into a breakdown state. But there's also a chance, and this is what my colleagues at Tellus, the founders there, have made it their life mission to say, we think there's a chance that we could shift into a breakthrough. We could shift into a new kind of civilization, a new kind of economy that's better organized. Now, we don't know how large the chance is, but we do think that there's a chance. Now, every age of civilization is defined by its dominant mode of economic activity. We had the agricultural age, it was defined by the farm. We had the industrial age, it was defined by the factory. And we have this idea that an economy is about producing more and more stuff. Well, that's factory thinking. That's what factories do. They produce stuff. If you produce more, isn't that the best kind of factory you can imagine? That's the mindset that we're operating in. But we also know that when economies evolve, there's two kinds of innovation that happen. There's physical technology innovation, wind turbines, solar, green manufacturing, and so forth. But there's also innovation in social technologies, which is about property rights or corporations or capital markets. And these are social technologies about how we organize ourselves to do things. Another word for it is social architecture. It's about the blueprints of human relations. In the agricultural age, we had the farm and we had evolution of property rights. Because if you're going to stay in one place and plant stuff, you got to have property rights. And so that was a co-evolution of physical and social technologies. We saw it in the Industrial Revolution. We had factories. Well, we needed a new kind of property, so we had corporations and capital markets where we traded this kind of property. So these things co-evolve. And the problem that we're having right now is that corporations and capital markets are not well designed to handle the kind of problems that we're facing. Now, we see this a lot in my hometown of Salem. If I were to take a kayak out into the harbor, this is what I would see in the harbor near where I live. There's this aging coal plant. It was built 50 years ago. It was designed to last 30 years, and they've been duct taping it together ever since. There was an explosion there a few years ago. 3 men died. They put out so much mercury into the harbor that you can't eat the shellfish anymore. There used to be jobs at this factory. They've gone way, way down. And if you follow the plume of smoke across the harbor, there's a little town over there called Marblehead that has a large number of cancer clusters because it's right downwind from this plant. Their citizens have been trying to shut this plant down for over a decade and haven't been able to do it. And the reason is that this plant is owned by Dominion, which is a publicly traded corporation. And publicly traded corporations are not designed to listen to citizens. They're not designed to care about health effects. They're not designed to care about global warming or shellfish or cancer clusters. They're designed to care about one thing, and that is maximize your profits so as to raise your share price. That's what they're designed to do. And they're darn good at it. We saw a good example of this in 2007 when the company spent $6 billion buying back its own stock. Now, maybe I'm the only person who gets excited about these things. But this is actually a very exciting little chart here, and I'll tell you why. This is a company with $16 billion in revenue. Now, that's a B, not an M, billion. Here's a company that is telling a little town of Salem, about 35,000 people, you know, we can't afford to pay the property taxes we used to pay. So they've somehow managed to negotiate their property taxes down in half. The rest of us are seeing our property taxes double, but theirs have gone down. They're also saying to Salem, you know, we can't really afford to clean up this plant and make it healthier and safer. We just can't afford that. Meanwhile, Salem is laying off teachers because we don't have the ability to pay them. So this company that can't afford to pay another $3 or $4 million in property taxes somehow managed to find $6 billion to buy back its own stock, which is a really interesting thing. Now, you can see where the little pink arrow is, that spike. That's where the buyback occurred. And the interesting thing is that less than a year after the buyback, the stock was trading lower than it had been before the buyback. Now, this is very arcane stuff, so stick with me for a minute. What happens when a company buys back its own stock? I mean, what the heck is that? I'm showing a chart of one company. There are hundreds of companies that do this kind of stuff. It was just normal stuff. Okay, so what is it that happens? Let's say that there's 4 people who own a house, okay? So you each have an equal share. You each have a quarter of the house. But you remove one of those shares. We won't say what happened to that person. We'll just sort of quietly remove them. So now you have 3 people owning the same house. Well, the value of each share has gone up, right? You didn't do anything to improve the house. We didn't put a new roof on it. We didn't repair the foundation. We just removed one of the shares, and the value of the other shares goes up. It's a paper transaction. Now, this very expensive paper transaction worked long enough that it allowed the CEO, Thomas Farrell, to walk off this year with a personal paycheck of $16 million. But within a few months, the little bubble that had been created had evaporated. Poof, all that wealth was gone. So what they had bought was $6 billion was thin air. But this made perfect sense to them, and makes perfect sense to a lot of corporations. And it's a very good definition of a system design that's broken. I mean, here we are at a time of a massive energy crisis where we're threatening all life on the planet because we're putting too much carbon in the air. And plants like this, electric plants put out 40% of the CO2 that is a global warming gas. And here you have one of the largest energy companies in the nation. And what does it think its responsibility is? To get its price up in its stock this quarter and to ignore everything else. Now, that's a bit of insanity. It's also not the only way to design an energy company. This is something that I have been researching. There's a second book I'm working on. The working title, these things change from week to week, but the title this week is Next, the Revolution in Social Architecture that is Building an Alternative Economy. And so I've been traveling around the world saying, well, how would you design companies some other way? If this is such a nutty way to design them, you get tired after a while of talking about what's wrong. So how would you do it? At Corporation 2020, which is this initiative that one of my colleagues and I at Tellus Institute started, we've been gathering experts in corporate governance and finance and law and civil society, environment, labor, and getting them in a room together twice a year and saying, well, what are the bells and whistles and how would you design these kind of things? And I decided I want to go actually and just find some of these. And I found a really interesting one actually here in Minnesota. It's MinWind. It's in Laverne, Minnesota, down in southwest Minnesota. Now, this is a wind company that is owned by farmers and local citizens. When they wanted to go out and build their first 4 wind towers, they raised $4 million, and they did it locally. They sold shares for $5,000 a piece, sold them like that. In fact, they've raised more money since then, and they're always oversubscribed. They have more people who want to buy into these things than they have shares to sell. This is a company that when it produces energy, there are no carbon emissions going on here. There's no mercury going into the land. And the wealth of this company stays local. It doesn't go off to some other state or to New York or Wall Street or something. It stays local. Now, wind farms are going up all over the country, and they're on land owned by farmers a lot of times. Now, farmers, they can what a lot of them are doing is they just lease the land to an absentee corporate owner. They get about 1% of the revenue from that wind farm. So if you've got, let's say, $100,000 comes into a wind farm, that farmer will get $1,000. Now with MinWind, when $100,000 comes in, $100,000 flows in wind. It can create jobs, it can pay investors, and that wealth can stay local. It goes into the local supply chain. Now it's not a get-rich-quick scheme, but it is a way to keep wealth local. And while this is happening in Minnesota, this is one of the very few companies that's like this, unfortunately. There's kind of tax reasons and tax incentive design and things like that that are part of the problem. But that's beginning to change now. But when you think about MinWind versus Dominion, what's the difference that's going on? Well, there's two things going on there. One is you got a change in physical technology. You switched from coal to wind. And the other is you have a change in social architecture. Instead of having absentee corporate owners, you have local cooperative owners. This happens to be an LLC designed like a cooperative. So they sort of, their aim is to distribute the wealth fairly and keep the wealth local. Now, this kind of innovation is happening all over the world right now. There's just some tremendously exciting things happening. I visited Denmark recently, and the election, that country has transitioned to wind faster than the entire rest of the world, and has done it in large part. People in Denmark, all of us could go invest a couple $1,000s in a wind farm if we wanted to, because there's been a system design. Now, it's interesting here because, you see, this is not government regulation as we think about it. It's not government trying to restrain corporations. It's government acting more as a system designer, more as a catalyst. How can we get the incentives designed right so that things start to happen, which is different than clubbing somebody over the head? So in Denmark, they have aligned the incentives correctly so that people want to own local wind, and it's happening. We're also seeing it in the banking industry. I don't know how well known this is, but a lot of people say that we've been in a banking crisis in this country. Well, the mega banks have been in a crisis, but the community banks have not. If you look at community banks, by and large, they have survived this crisis in pretty good shape. I visited recently with Beverly Cooperative Bank, which is just down the road from where I live, and the CEO there told me he's got 1,000 more foreclosures this year, and I had 0 last year. And this is a bank that is it's owned by cooperative principles. It's slightly different than other cooperatives, but it's chartered locally. Its mission is to serve its customers. Its mission isn't to serve Wall Street. It wants to serve its customers. It has to make money like everybody else, but it didn't get into these shenanigans because it didn't have these quarterly earnings to worry about. Credit unions, community development financial institutions, community banks, they've all been well in this downturn. They're proving more resilient. They're more suited to this kind of spiky, unpredictable atmosphere that we find ourselves in. And the reason is that they're not designed for absentee stockholders. They're designed to serve the community. Now, even large corporations, we're seeing some very promising experimentation. I recently visited a company in Denmark called Novo Nordisk. Now, this is a pharmaceutical. It has 6 billion euro in revenue, or its revenues. So 6 billion. That's a pretty big company, and it's owned by a foundation. It's publicly traded, but it's controlled by a foundation. That means that foundation keeps control of the mission. The mission is to defeat diabetes, and this company is governed by a board that's each year requires that company to come to, the executives have to go to that board and say, here's how we serve the environment this year, here's how we serve the community. They have to report on that just like they report on their financial earnings. In the US, there's an intriguing model. It's called Google. Some of you might have heard of this one. It's a philanthropic arm of Google.com. Now, it's a philanthropy, so it makes grants. but it also makes investments. And it's a division of the company. It sits right alongside finance or marketing, and then there's a philanthropic arm. But people who work in this philanthropic arm, when they go to work at Google.org, their job is to solve disease, climate change, poverty. That's their job. And it's a new model. It's being called for-profit philanthropy. There are experiments that are called catch shares, where people are being given ownership rights, or something kind of like ownership rights in marine fisheries. And these have been shown to halt or even reverse some of the catastrophic declines that we're seeing in fishes. They're not Wikipedia. It's owned by nobody. It's managed by the community. And the aim is not to make anybody wealthy, but to advance cultural understanding. Now, these architectures are profoundly new. They represent something profoundly different. I think of them as a kind of greenhouse of design experimentation. And we just might find the future of our economy growing here. Now, they're not yet fully developed. They're not ready to take over the world. But their growing profusion is a signal. And they're a signal that we're entering one of the most creative periods of economic innovation since the Industrial Revolution. But it's not innovation as we usually think about it in the economy. It's not about more and more clever ways to make more and more money. It's about how do you serve the needs of life. This is something quite different. Now, I think of it as a school of thought, of design that's developing around these kind of entities. And if we were to name it, I would suggest that we would call it generative design. And generative design, it comes from the same Greek root that means earth. It's the root that we find in the word genesis, or genetics. And generative means carrying on life. And generative design is about the institutional genetic code for doing so. How do you design institutions that their fundamental purpose is to carry on life? And making money is part of that purpose. Their purpose is to generate the conditions for life. These designs are about generating real wealth, not phantom wealth that can evaporate in a quarter. They're about helping people stay in their homes, about creating jobs, about generating clean energy at the same time that we generate shared prosperity. So I would suggest that it might be time to ask ourselves, that while we try to restrain the worst excesses of capitalism, and we have to continue to do that, but can we also find ways to encourage the emergence of the new? We can do this as ourselves when we choose where do you bank, where do you shop, where do you work. We can do this through government. We can demand that our government stop bailing out the failing institutions of capitalism and start supporting the emergence of the new. Stop bailing out Bank of America and begin to ask ourselves, how can we reinvigorate community banks? It's important, I think, as a society that we begin to recognize that an alternative economy is possible. It's tremendously powerful to even just see that as a group. Now, this seems like a pipe dream, to think that these tiny little designs might actually go somewhere or evolve into something. I want to offer just one hopeful fact. And that is that when you look at the 13 largest corporations in the world, and this is from Fortune magazine's list, the 13 largest corporations in the world, 12 of them are fossil fuel companies. The one exception is Walmart. It's number one. The rest of them, they're auto companies and they're oil companies. And we're running out of oil on this planet. Certainly we're running out of easily found oil. In 50 years, maybe even in 20, those companies will all be gone or they will be completely transformed. They'll be something else. They're not going to be precisely what they are now, 50 years from now. So this is the kind of creative destruction that capitalism has always been known for. An economy is going away and a new economy is being born. And the question, what is that design of that new economy? Not just its physical technology, but its social architecture. What shape will that take? This is the question that I think that we can ask today. Because we're at this time, it's times like this, as difficult as they are, this is the times that we plant the seeds of the new. And it's a time when we need to begin thinking like cathedral builders. I mean, we're building something that we may not see complete in our lifetime, but it will be here for generations to come. Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Good.
We have time for questions, so please, if you have questions or like to engage in some dialogue with Ms. Kelly, come to the microphones and she'll recognize you and we'll talk about it.
Good. Thank you for your topic.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fascinating one and it's a critical time. I have a difficult time as I see how capitalism is working in the world today, identifying how capitalism will ever integrate with long-term growth in research and development, because it seems that all of Wall Street is rewarding short-term dividends as opposed to long-term investment. So where's the Bell Laboratories of the world in the future? And I'm hoping you could address that for a moment.
Yeah, so where's the Bell Laboratories of the future? And I think it's all kinds of different places. I mean, if you look at companies, some of the very largest companies today, they didn't even exist 10 years ago. So there are companies being invented right now that we've never heard of that could dominate our economy in the next 10 years. So I think that we have to, I think it's very helpful. Am I getting some feedback here? Something feels a little odd. At any rate, I think it's very helpful to begin to see our economy in time. Because if you look at it as a static snapshot, it looks like a brick wall. And it looks like it's a brick wall, we're hitting our heads against it, it'll never change, and we just want to like lay down and give up. But if you think of it through time, there are institutions that seem eternal that do change. And this is one of the things that I talked about in my book, The Divine Right of Capital. I made the analogy to monarchy. I think it's a very powerful analogy. Because when you look at monarchy, there was a time when, monarchy as an institution reached back to the very dawn of civilization. We had Pharaoh. It was the very first social architecture that we had, really, was the monarchy. And it was universal. It was in every society. And it seemed to be the only way that you could ever organize government. But monarchy fell in a 10-year period. And I actually spent about 5 years reading about this because I thought, can that possibly be true? But it was true. The Qing dynasty in China fell in 1908. The Ottoman Empire went down. In World War I, European empires, 3 European empires went down. And by the end of World War I, 1918, you had monarchies, as one person said, crowns were literally rolling around the floor. And the monarchy collapsed. It looked solid, but it kind of fell from its own weight. And today, there's a few monarchies, but not many. So I guess I would say, can I sit here and tell you, here are the 3 steps that are going to get us to transformational change? No, I can't. I don't think we know what they are. But what I can say is that when a system is not functioning and when it's hitting the limits, it's hitting real limits, some kind of change is going to happen, some kind of flip is going to happen. Mm-hmm.
One of the aspects or facets that I'm still puzzled about after having read your book and having heard you tonight, and especially in light of the analogy you just made now, as you do in your book, to monarchies and aristocracies, I don't understand how these wonderful ideas that you suggest can actually be made to come about. Will this be a grassroots effort? Will this be something that legislatures do by legislative fiat revoking charters or forcing amendments to charters or ousting boards of directors and replacing them legislatively. Your analogy to monarch as it leads into my question, can any of this be done without a very bloody revolution?
That's interesting. How many people do feel that there needs to be some kind of bloody revolution? Hands. And how would say that there doesn't need to be one, need to be a bloody revolution? Okay, just to give you, and how many people don't have a clue? Just to give you a little feedback, when I said bloody revolution, I saw about 5 or 6 hands. No bloody revolution, I probably saw 20. And no clue, I maybe saw 40. I don't think we know the answer. I don't think we need a revolution. What are we going to revolt against? What is investing in the stock market, and then what? You know, I don't think it's that simple. I don't think there's anything to revolt against. I don't think there's any heads to chop off. I think it's more complicated than that. And so, you know, so you're saying, how do we get there? I think it has to happen in a whole. I mean, remember that we're talking about a global system. We're talking about a global system. It took us 100, 200 years to get here. It changed very fast. And I guess I kind of think of a model of you find alternatives that are working. We begin to understand some of the system design principles so that we have some confidence that if we were to rush in and put a new system in place, that it might actually work. So we begin to understand what would come next, what would that look like, and then we begin to figure out how do you get. I mean, I was part of a citizens group, Citizens for Corporate Redesign, that we drafted some legislation here in Minnesota that may even be getting hearings coming up. The citizen group that was working for it fell apart and is no longer working for it. It was the idea of creating an alternative charter. It doesn't seem to be going much of anywhere. I've seen an effort in Europe. Some friends of mine gathered together a large coalition and worked to change corporate charters in Europe. Said we want to get rid of shareholder primacy and put a broader mandate in place. They had like hundreds of citizen groups working on this over years. When they finally got something through, it was watered down to the point where it said corporations ought to report on their impact on us, and they ought to do it only if it has a material advantage on their returns. That's what ended up in law. I don't have a lot of faith in doing this through the government process. I mean, you know, I don't think that you force it through that way. I do think that there are a lot of government incentives. They're right now changing tax incentives because there can be more cooperative ownership of wind. That's really important. There's lots of, I think, sort of incremental changes that government can do, but I don't think you can sort of do this big, massive change and push it through the government. I don't think we're in that nature of that kind of change. I would say that I have some confidence that we're going to make it and that things are going to get better. And how exactly we're going to do it, I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thanks for your remarks. The title of your talk is Democracy in the Corporation, but I'm not sure we heard much, analytically at least, about the state of democracy, mm-hmm. which in my view is in need of some structural adjustment, to borrow a term from the econ crowd. We have the unholy trinity of democracy, whatever that means. When I hear neoliberalism, so democracy, the free market, and corporations all hell-bent on maximizing profits, more or less because of shareholder primacy, which you just mentioned. So what is to be done with that? Have now does not look like the ideals that some of us still believe in. I don't happen to hold that view. However, I didn't necessarily believe in them to begin with. But what is the state of democracy today, vis-a-vis the structures of neoliberalism and the corporatocracy that you described so well?
Yeah, right. Well, I think that we know the state of democracy. I think one of the most signs I see, who has been in charge of, well, it was Hank Paulson to start with. Who was Hank Paulson? He was the former head of Goldman Sachs. And Goldman Sachs was the investment banking firms that got us into the mess. in the first place, creating all these derivatives on top of this asset bubble. And there was actually Hank Paulson and the other investment banks approached the Bush administration at one point and said, there are legal limits right now on the amount of leverage that we can take on, and leverage means, if I've got $1,000, I'm going to go out and borrow money, and I'm going to bet $20,000. That's leverage of 20 to 1. And they were doing leverage of 20 to 1, and they said that's not enough. We're not making enough money. 30 to 1, 35 to 1. So when that happens, when I borrow your money and I gamble with it and I lose it, my money that I lost, it's your money. This is what happened, and then so that is about a fix. Many Goldman Sachs people still in the Obama administration, and it really keeps even Obama, who I think many of us had going to be an answer. He's not able. I won't say able. He's certainly thinking about transformation because he checks Wall Street. I mean, democracy is in the pocket of the wealthy. And one of the most frightening pieces about that is a Supreme Court case, which you might be following right now, which is they're saying there are limits on corporations cannot lead to political campaigns. But there's a case right now that says maybe we ought to rethink that, maybe to contribute to campaigns, which is a very, very frightening prospect. So yes, I mean, I think there is a huge problem front and center. And I'm talking about maybe a few little solutions I hear off to the corner. And so I understand that there's this huge misfit between them. I think what I would say, is I have spent 20 years of my life trying to go at corporations and change them. And I haven't, not I only succeeded, but I mean, publication, I've been writing about it, I've been tracking about it. I just think we have been trying that frontal assault and it's not working. I think we need to grow an alternative. That's where I'm putting my energy, because this one seems to be crumbling and hitting the wall.
If I could just have a quick follow-up.
Sure.
One of the themes, I'm sorry. One of the themes of your book in response to your response just a moment ago is the problem of wealth discrimination. So what do we do about that? Which is as intractable, it would seem, as race, gender, class, sexual orientation. And we don't think about discrimination in terms of wealth in the same way that some of us have begun to think about discrimination based on race, class, gender.
Right, yeah,
so as we move on, what do we do there? One of the pieces of analysis I did in Divine Right, as I talked about how wealth discrimination, I think is really the root that you used to have wealthy white men held the property, held the power. Women were held in a sense as property. Blacks were held in a sense as property. And we some of those forms of discrimination, but the notion of holding property and wealth accruing to property owners is still there. Again, I do think that awareness about wealth discrimination is important. I don't think anger is going to get us to transformation. But the other thing I would say is I think we need to, whatever you feel in your heart or you feel in your own life, that's important. I need to work on it. Then I would say, because we don't know what's going to work. We all need to just do whatever it is that we feel like we need, that we see needs to be done, because it's going to take a whole lot of different things. Thank you.
I don't feel any better about the economy after this talk, I'm afraid, but I haven't read your book. I think there's a lot of despair and frustration among us voters, and every year we go to the polls and we vote for our hearts, and we don't vote for corporatocracy, the corrupt crony capitalism that is in control. They control the Supreme Court. If there's an anti-corporate case going before the Supreme Court, it's not going to win. And they control all the politicians on both Democratic and Republican side, a few rare exceptions. And we know what happened with corporate control of the White House. There's a sense of powerlessness all around here and frustration. And I think we see the people who are, we know who is at fault. It's the corrupt crony capitalists who control the excess luxury wealth holders.
Right.
And we see them as criminals. Many of them are international war criminals. The Cheney administration was a bunch of international war criminals by definition, crimes against the peace, crimes against humanity. And they're not getting punished. And we see the corporations, it's not humans that are destroying the environment, it's corporations that are destroying it. I notice you use the common term, it's man affecting the environment. No, it's corporations that are affecting the environment. And they're raping the land, they're raping the soil, they're raping the oil, or the air, and they're not being punished. And when rapists aren't getting punished, you know that it's going to continue. So I think people are demanding punishment, at least Truth and Reconciliation Commission of some sort. The truth, we get commissions that, nonpartisan commissions that are investigating this stuff. And when rapists don't get punished, the people get angry. And I think that you mentioned monarchy is going down. I don't know in your book if you addressed the French Revolution or not, when the king, who was in cahoots with the military, in cahoots with the Catholic Church. I apologize to St. Scholastica, but the Catholic Church was very corrupt before that time. And I remember reading, the revolutionists said, the revolution will be complete.
Is there a question?
Yeah.
Can you sort of boil it into a question?
Yes, I want to, one other little mention. The revolution said will be complete when the last lawyer is strangled by the guts of the last priest. They wanted some reconciliation. They wanted some justice, and they didn't get it, so they had a bloody revolution. So I'm in favor of non-bloody revolutions, but I think there needs to be a revolution. But how will we exact punishment of the obvious corporate criminals that have gotten us in this mess? That's my question.
Yeah, so he's asking, he said he's a believer in non-bloody revolutions, but how do we punish the corporate criminals who got us into this? Well, it's a very good question. And, I think that what we don't do is do massive bailouts of companies and ask nothing in return. I think this is what we don't do. Kind of just handing money over and saying, okay, go ahead and keep paying yourself billions of dollars. Bank of America bought one of the investment banks, and they $1 billion in bonuses at the very end of the year. So it's crazy stuff. I think, and see, this is why I think it's important to have an idea of an alternative economy in our mind. What would it look like in more community-rooted, different of success? Because then when moments like this happen, we could say, okay, here we're bailing this bank out. We're going to make some demands on this bank. We're going to put a new charter in place. We're going to put a new board in place. We're going to put a new definition of success in place. And we're going to say you're only going to get your bonuses if you have environmental policies or if you pay fairly. So these are kind of moments that I think we could recognize if we began to have in our head the idea that something else was possible. And that's what I feel like is missing. I feel like and there was a piece in the New York Times today talking about how socialism in Europe is crumbling. So we don't really have an idea of what it even is that we want. And I don't think sort of just punishing the bad guys. It doesn't get us there. So, but making some demands when we're doing these enormous bailouts. Let's put some demands on companies and begin to make some real change. Some other questions, some other comments. Very good. Thanks for coming. Good.
Well, thank you all for coming. Just to promote what's next, a month from now, October 20th, W. Michael Cox, part of the Federal Reserve System for 20 years, will tell us we're better off than we think. So I hope you'll all come to that. And so we might get a different message. there's refreshments. There should be refreshments and out in the back. And pretty soon we'll get some books, if we don't have them already, The Divine Right of Capital, so our guests can sign books. If you'd like to buy some, do a little capital. There's a sign-up sheet for people who want to be on the mailing list for additional programs. Thank you all very much for coming.